I have a couple announcements before we get started. I know you're all here to see hear Vernon, and I know he doesn't need any introduction, so I'll just say welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back and to see so many familiar faces and friends again. I'm excited about it. We on Wednesday mornings, our church has men's life group at 8 o'clock. So I was down at my church in Sun Lakes this morning at 7:30 this morning, and we had the men's life, and they wanted to chit chat after the meeting, and I said, I gotta go, bye, and out the door I went. If you remember, the last time I was here, the topic was the battle for God, and I was using Karen Armstrong and her book about the roots of conflict within the Middle East as pertains to Jewish, Christian, and Muslim realities, religious traditions and faith traditions, and talking about how a lot of the conflict really is historical, going back generations and centuries, as well as cultural, meaning the tribal culture of the Middle East, and religious in the way that three of the world's great religions share a common space, and that was what that presentation was about. And if anybody has seen it or had the chance to read the book by Robert Feiler, Abraham, A Journey to the Heart of Three Faiths, that when I read this book, what it did is it alerted me even more to the idea that three of these of the great religions share a common starting point, and his focus is, well, how do each of those traditions understand Abraham as a way of getting at how we might be able to draw from the common heritage of Abraham to begin to look at overcoming some of that conflict that we find ourselves in. So that was the idea, kind of a follow through on what I did last year and how we can talk about it this year. It's not an easy topic for sure, because obviously when we go back into the mist of time, there isn't much historical information that we really have about many of the people that are in the Hebrew Scripture, Old Testament, and so forth. All we have is really the biblical testimony. There are bits and pieces found in other places that at least mention a name of, let's say, one of the ancient kings. It was only about 4 years ago that in some of the archaeological excavations, both in Jerusalem and a site up in the north called Dan, which was one of the tribes of Israel, had located itself up in the furthest northern point of contemporary Israel. In fact, it borders Lebanon and Syria, and if you ever go up there, Caesarea Philippi is the New Testament site that's related to it.
Near Nazareth?
No, it's even further north than Nazareth, at the headwaters of the Jordan River, where the Jordan River gushes out of the side of the foothills of the Mount Hermon. And you see the borderline between Lebanon and you actually can go up on the Golan Heights from there. Why am I telling you that story? That in the excavations of the ancient Tel of Dan, that they found an inscription with the letters for David. And it was the first historical piece of evidence outside of the Bible, outside of the text of the Bible, that now led them to say, David was actually a historical person. Can you believe that? Wow. And most recently in the excavations in Jerusalem, in what was called the City of David, they've also found the name of David printed out in ancient Hebrew. So it tells us that when we talk about people like Abraham, we don't have the collaborating evidence or information that would come from the historical record. All we have is a biblical text. So having said that, what scholars tell us about Abraham is that he was born in a place called Ur, U-R. And Ur is non-existent today, but it would be somewhere south of modern-day Baghdad in Iraq. And of course, at that time, the Tigris and Euphrates River, the region was called Mesopotamia, or the land between the rivers. It will be the home of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and until the end of World War I, it was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Remember when we did that? It was a part of the Ottoman Empire, and then at the end of World War I, the British and French carved up the Ottoman Empire, and it was actually under the British protectorate in what becomes modern-day Iraq. But he seemed to be born, the story from the Bible says, in the land of Ur. His home seemed to be in Haran, Haran, which is farther north, probably almost in the Kurdish region of Iraq today, possibly even southern Turkey, modern-day Turkey. That seemed to be the home that he had. And Haran happens to be on the trading routes across Asia, across the area from Turkey into China, north to south, let's say from, and I'm using modern terms today, Russia, down through into Mesopotamia, and would eventually go down into Egypt. So Haran was a trading center on the caravan routes, east, west, north, and south. Remember, yeah?
Vernon, would that route be the same one that the Israelites might have taken? Because they've just recently found settlements in Afghanistan of Jewish people.
It would certainly be at the time of the exile, when first to Syria in its attack on the northern kingdom of Israel and destroying the city of Samaria, and Jews or Israelites are sent into exile, and then Babylon when they destroy Jerusalem, when Israelites are sent into exile, that certainly they would follow the caravan routes where people would go. So that's why you would find populations of Israelites or Jews in modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and
No, they went that far east.
Well, you know, when you're sent into exile, it's not like you go into prison, even though you would be, you know, not free to do whatever you wanted to do. But you would then be sent to wherever the empire sent you to continue to produce crops or raise flocks of sheep and goats and cattle for the purpose of the empire. You just weren't doing it for yourself, you were now doing it for the empire. So the story goes that while he is in Haran, and the dating of this, and I should have given you that, the dating of this is around about 1850 1850 BC. Sorry about that.
Did they write then?
The writing would have been, if you've seen things, cuneiform. Or in Egypt, because Egypt goes back even further than 1850 BC, would have been hieroglyphs for the Egyptians. But the people in Mesopotamia would have been using cuneiform. And I don't know if you've ever seen any cuneiform. It's like arrows and sticks and that. And so however that works.
Is that what the word means?
What?
Cuneiform?
I don't know. I don't know where the word comes from, but it probably does represent just the sticks and arrows and things like that, right? So they did have a writing system at that time, but most of the people, remember, the cities were not very large, if anything. In fact, just as you asked that question, about 5, maybe longer, at least the evidence came out. National Geographic had an article just last year or year before where in some excavations in southern Turkey, close to the Syria border where you hear all of the stuff today, that in the excavations of this one site in southern Turkey, the issue had always, the theory was that when finally nomadic people begin to coalesce into cities, that agriculture is born on a larger scale than just individual family, that you begin to raise crops and flocks and herds for the urban population, that when you have the establishment of cities and agriculture, that religion comes into being as a mechanism that is related to agriculture, the development of agriculture, and so forth. That's what the theory has been. When they found this site in southern Turkey, it seems as if that the site actually predates any urban civilization, and seems to be a religious site. And so the theorists now say is that perhaps religion is what leads to the development of agriculture and urbanization. It's a very interesting theory that archaeologists. But it happens, and this site goes back to, ready for it? 10,000 BC. Which in that area of Asia, Turkey, Syria, and so forth, is one of the earliest archaeological sites that gives evidence of, they've got pillars with animals on them and seemingly an altar in the middle of this. That is really, really an ancient archaeological site.
Where is that?
Southern Turkey, right along the Syrian border. Modern day Syria and Turkey in that area. So kind of to the eastern part of Turkey. The reason why I think that's important is that if you place Abraham, and this is one of the things that we always have to kind of consider, if you place Abraham in the context of the history, the culture, and so forth of the time, you begin to get a picture of him as he might have been in that moment in time, all right? So, we do know, seemingly, that he would have been a, what we would call today a nomad. That just sounds like a vagabond, kind of doing whatever he wants. But nomad would mean that, and as the scripture tells us, it's God, when God calls Abraham, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, that he's instructed to take his flocks with him. So the point of, if anybody's been to the Middle East, or particularly to Israel in, let's say, the last 20 years, the people today are called Bedouins. And the Bedouins are people who are not living in a city or a town or a village, but rather are people who, wherever the grass is green, meaning because of rains, that they move their sheep and their goats, and that for the purpose of grazing them wherever there's good grazing ground. That's what nomads do. They're not sedentary, but they're migratory. Wherever the ground is good, wherever the weather is good, that's where they're going to move to. So they're not farmers by any means, but more migratory. And you see them. In fact, there's a big move in Israel right now because they just have not yet figured out what to do with these crazy people that cross national borders because they're just perceived now as such a threat to the security and stability of Israel, that they're basically trying to urbanize the Bedouins and stop their migratory characteristics. And they really are migratory across Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. I mean, they just go wherever they want to go.
Don't they even go as far as Libya?
They don't go there. No, they don't go that far. But there would be people like that in all the country, in any country, right? I mean, we had our own migratory people here. I mean, maybe that's part of what the immigration thing is. People moving wherever you need to have people, to move crops and flocks and everything.
That probably counts the fact that they're always living in tents and stuff. So
Exactly.
Pick them up and take them with them.
Exactly. So that's a perfect picture of who Abraham was. That you'd have your whole your whole support system, not only children and relatives, and you basically, when you moved, it wasn't just, put it in your RV camper and off you'd go. I mean, it was quite a production. This is a part of the reason why when you think of migrants or migratory peoples or nomadic people is they don't have a written documentation of their story. Because you can imagine, I mean, if you go back to that ancient time, if we think of cuneiform in Mesopotamia, you're putting your information on clay tablets. Some are as small as this, and some of them are. I mean, can you imagine how many times you're going to pack and unpack, your clay tablets with your information on it? And if they're made of clay, I mean, it's albeit it's fire-baked clay. I mean, have you ever? How many of you do not have any chips on your china or dinnerware at home? Right? So, I mean, if for us, when we're keeping them in cabinets and, all we do is take it out of the dishwasher, put it on the table, put it back in the dishwasher, put it in the cabinet, we get chips. Could you imagine? So that nomadic people do not keep a written record of their life. And this is one of the problems we have with Abraham. What they keep is what? An oral record. Now, many sociologists will tell us that the cultures that are oral-based cultures, meaning they tell the story to one another, is that they're able to preserve the story pretty accurately. All right? For instance, if anybody has ever been to Australia and you've had an experience of going out to the outback and to encounter the Aborigine people in Australia, the Aborigine culture of Australia is one of the oldest cultures in the world. 40,000 years, sociologists say, the Aborigines have kept their culture. And they've kept it not because they've written it down, but because they continue to tell the story. Now think about it, and this is an important thing for Abraham. Think about what happens. You all know this because you probably have either gotten it from your grandchildren or your children, or you said it to your parents and your grandchildren, that the minute that the elder in the community says, "When I was your age," what's the response? You know what? I don't care what you did, Grandma. This is me. I'm not you, right? So what happens is that if the elder in the community is not able to tell the story to the next generation in such a way that the telling of the story captures the younger interest, then what happens to the story? It dies. Lots of our stories are dying these days because it's not capturing. So an oral culture learns that what it does is it tells the story with enough information in it that information becomes the preserved aspect, the preserved piece of the storytelling. But the storyteller, in good ways that storytellers do it, is you always add to what you've got to keep the interest of the next generation. And what are you also doing as you do that? Well, you kind of change. You don't really, you change it, but you add to it. But what also are you doing? And this is something we all got to learn. And looking at the age group of this group, and my age group down in Sun Lakes is no different. All right? That what also do you have to do? If the story is always about us, then what's the next generation think about that story? I'm not a part of it. And so what the ancient storyteller in an oral culture does is to tell the story. Abraham was so and so and so and so. But you tell the story to begin to move the current generation you're telling the story to into the story so they become a part of the story. And in becoming a part of the story, they're going to more quickly remember the story. But you see, what happens is, as each generation tells it, what's happening to the original story? It's changing by way of expanding the story. All right? Now, you see, what happens is that, and this is a little off to the side because I was trying to give you the history of Abraham and I got sidetracked. But what happens is that when it finally comes to be written down for the Scripture, guess when it starts to be written down? About 920 BC. Most scholars say during the time of Solomon. Now what was the original date I gave you for Abraham? 1800. So how many years is that? 900 years between the events that the Bible says happened and when they actually get written down. So what's the likelihood, and this is a plug to us not being literalist or fundamentalist about reading the Bible, that what happens is that what we've got here is perhaps more the product of the time of King Solomon than it is actually the time of Abraham. But remember, I suggested that in an oral culture, oral cultures have a way of pretty successfully maintaining the story as each generation hears it and receives it and hands it on. So having said that, let me finish the story, all right? So if Abraham grows up and lives and manages his family in Haran, one aspect of thinking about the Abraham story is that it just seemed natural that he wouldn't spend all of his life in Haran, because if he happens to be a nomadic sheep herder, that he's going to go where the rest of the folks are going and where there is good grazing ground for his sheep. So as a migrant or as a nomad, he seems then to follow the caravan path from Haran. Now he's down kind of over here. Let's see if you kind of picture a map. Down here in Haran, southern Iraq, modern day Iraq. Haran becomes his home place up in northern Iraq. And the migration path is to either go all the way over to the sea coast, like down the coast of where modern day Lebanon and Israel is, or you go down the Jordan River, which is the Great Rift Valley. And you know anything about the Great Rift Valley? The Great Rift Valley is this tear in the earth's crust that starts about northern Israel, goes down through the Lake of Galilee, goes down through the Dead Sea, goes down across the Red Sea into Africa, goes down the west of Africa, all the way down. If you've heard of Rwanda and Burundi and Tanzania, and anybody ever hear of the, who's that couple, the Leakeys, who have done the research in the Olduvai Gorge. The Olduvai Gorge is a part of this Great Rift Valley. Now notice, all the way up in northern Israel, all the way down, all the way, it crosses under the ocean, see, and goes all the way down the central part of Africa. So it's a tearing apart of the crust of the earth.
Can that be called a division between place?
Yes, it's one of those divisions, seemingly, they're not quite sure, but seemingly one of the divisions of the plate. So for instance, the Lake of Galilee is almost 900 feet below sea level. And of course the Dead Sea is over 1,000 feet below sea level. So and if you go down, as the rift goes into Africa, you see a similar story. Where it comes into Africa is Eritrea, and Eritrea right there, what's called the Horn of Africa, and down that way. Anyway, so Abraham follows this. So you could either go all the way over to the ocean, but you see who governs, who controls the ocean route, are the Philistines, are the Canaanites, are the Egyptians, and who seems to rule the area that Abraham ends up going to at this time at 1850 BC are the Egyptians. He goes down, probably down the Rift Valley, down the Jordan River, and ends up at a place called Beersheba. And Beersheba today sits in the middle of the Negev Desert. It sat in the middle of the Negev Desert back then too. But the Negev Desert of modern Israel, out in the middle of nowhere. You think our desert is bad. Oh my God. I'll never forget, I went to Beersheba precisely to go to where the ancient tell of Beersheba was. And the hotel that I was staying in happened to be an English Jew. And he said, "So where are you from?" And I said, "Phoenix." And he said, "Phoenix?" He said, "Isn't that in the desert?" And I kind of chuckled. I said, well, where the hell do you think you live in the middle of the desert? And he said, well, it gets hot there. And so I tried to make the trend, between Fahrenheit and centigrade. And I said, well, it gets to be about 45 centigrade. I don't know, that just seemed like a lot to me. And he looked at me and he says, you live there? Well, yeah, you live in the desert too, but I guess our desert's hotter than their desert. But anyway, so it really is not a very pleasant place to live. It's not sand dunes and things like that, but it's much like what our desert is. Huh?
No air conditioning either.
Oh, no. Yeah, right. Anyway, that seemed to be then the home of Abraham for the rest of his life, is somewhere near Beersheba. Again, an important part of the story historically is that Egypt was in control of this territory at the time. I tell that because an incident in the life of Abraham where it says, and he goes down to Egypt. Well, in 1850 BC, that's not too far. You don't have to go very far. And the story is that an Egyptian official looks at Sarah, his wife, and says, gee, she looks pretty cool and pretty hot, so I think I want her for my harem. And Abraham goes, no, because she's my sister. And I remember teaching this in a very conservative Grand Canyon University, and all the fundamentalist evangelical Christians get all upset because how could this possibly be? This is incest and adultery, and Abraham lies and all of these crazy things. Well, you see, in placing Abraham in a historical context, the awareness is that in the time period, whether Egypt or the nomadic culture, is that you basically could take a woman from another harem for your own in your harem, and all you had to do is say, I want her, and if you were of a higher social ranking, you had the right to do that, or the power or the authority to do that. So here, Abraham is not Egyptian, he's what we would say today Semitic. The Egyptians are in control and power, and so Abram's a lower social status. The Egyptian is higher. So in a sense, according to the custom of Egypt, and we know this by way of the study of the Egyptian documents and stories and all of that today, is that the Egyptian could take Sarah. But when Abram says, she's my sister, you see in that culture, as it is in some cultures even today, is that the eldest brother, if the father was absent, the eldest brother had property rights over anyone else in the family, particularly the sisters in the family. And so when Abram says, she's my sister, that now added something that the Egyptian official could not do anything about. That Abram had to give the permission for the giving away of his sister.
Even though he was supposedly of a different
level. You see, this is one of the things that I think anthropologists and sociologists are helping us to understand by way of archaeology and the study of whatever minimally the texts are of the ancient world, that it's helping us to understand the culture of 2,000, 3,000 BC, 5,000 years ago in a better way, so that what does that help us do in terms of the biblical text then? See, it helps us to understand the biblical text better. So that rather than having this very heroic idea of who Abraham is, as the Bible tells it, we put Abraham into the context of the history and the culture of the day, and then some of the biblical stories begin to make sense to us, maybe in a different way than what we've read them before, because now we see Abraham as a nomad, living under Egyptian control, having to deal with the conflict between the Egyptian cultural ways of doing things and his own nomadic way of doing things. This is why the story at the end, we'll see this in a moment, why the story at the end that when the three visitors come to the tent, that he busies himself about providing hospitality for them. Because that's the nomadic way of doing things. You have to provide, like, oh gee, can I offer you a glass of lemonade? Go on your way. But you throw a feast for them. because that's the nomadic tradition and the way to do things. By the way, you still see that in some of the Muslim cultures, I shouldn't say Muslim, in the Arab cultures of the Middle East today. You still see that sense of hospitality and welcome. We were on our way from the top of Mount Carmel down to Haifa and had a busload of pilgrims. And a fellow was walking along the way, and the bus driver stopped, and the guide, and he chatted, and he opens the door, and this guy gets on our bus, and I'm just like, who's this guy getting on our bus? Well, the bus driver knew him, and the guide knew him too, and he lived, maybe 8 or 9 miles down the road, and we were going to be passing by his house. And so the bus driver picked him up and, provided transportation. It would have, he would have taken him maybe 4 hours to get to his house, and we got him there in 20 minutes. And when we stopped outside of his house, he said, "Come on in for tea and cookies." There were 25 of us on the bus, and we kind of thought, wow, his wife is going to really be happy about that. And he was a little bit offended when we thanked him, but no, because you see, he was offering this hospitality because we had done something for him, and so he was going to return the favor by, providing hospitality. And I just thought that was a little much. 25 people showing up at your wife's doorstep, for coffee and tea, and I'm sure they would have had it provided for us. Unlike us, right? My gosh, how many of us would be willing to welcome in 25 people off the street for hospitality? Anyway, I try to tell first the history of Abraham, because in that we're all in agreement about, more or less. We can say, here's who the historical person of Abraham is. Now what I want to do is the handout that I've given you to make a move a little bit to say, well, how do Jews today, how do Jews understand, or what does the biblical testimony about Abraham tell us? Now when we move to that level, we're not really anymore talking about history. Even though I gave you a little insight that if you read that story about Abram and Sarah and the Egyptian official and so forth, and there's several other stories in the narrative of Abraham, as the book of Genesis tells us, that you could also locate it historically and comment on it historically, all right? When we come to the biblical story, because this is what forms the foundation of Jews, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, that when we read the biblical text now, we're not really reading it anymore with history in mind. We're reading it as this story has been handed on within a faith community. And as that story is handed on within a faith community, here's something to consider about. And this is true for everything. The narrative of Jesus' life, right? If you talk to Roman Catholics or you talk to Missouri Synod Lutherans, I bet you're going to come up with a little bit of a different story, right? Because what happens when we tell a narrative within the context of our faith community? What happens? Huh? Well, a lot of the way we tell the story is influenced by who we are as a faith community, so we actually read the narrative through the lens of our faith community. So our faith community is doing an interpretation of a story, of a narrative, that in and of itself could be read within a historical context. But when we read it on Sunday, or we read it in our own Bible meditation, that we're no longer reading it as a historical narrative. We're now reading it as one of those stories handed on within a faith community from generation to generation. And when we receive it, it's supposed to do something for us. Or we're supposed to understand it in a certain way. Or we take some meaning in the story, or find some meaning in the story that is meant to influence us in our lives in some way or another. What this issue is talking about is, can we say that the Bible is still relevant for us? And by the way, anybody under 40 has already decided there's no relevancy in this whatsoever. Why? Who are these people? They have nothing to do with my life. Walter Brueggemann often said that you do all of that historical stuff. You do all the investigation. And then you set it aside, and then you look at the text. And he goes on to say is that what we have to already say is that the text is relevant. Why? Because it's been handed on to us. If it wasn't relevant, it wouldn't have got handed on to us.
That's right.
Because a generation a long time ago would have already decided that it has no meaning or no relevancy to us. By the way, you know how this is said in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John? This is how it's said. Jesus did and said many other things that are not recorded here.
Duh.
So you have to say, like, the Bible, the New Testament, the Gospels don't contain everything that Jesus said and did. Which means a lot didn't get handed on. So there's a lot that we don't know about Jesus. We presume everything in the Bible is all that we need to know. Right? No, not everything in the Bible is exactly how it happened, because a lot of it never got handed on and never got preserved, because it was judged either not to be relevant or so time-orientated. Guess what? You know what those things are? Time-orientated, that it doesn't get to the next generation. Hint, hint, hint. It's what my old Roman Catholic community still fights with and struggles with. Well, if Jesus wanted women to be priests, he would have ordained his mother. Have you heard that? Well, excuse me, in first century Judaism, that would not have been possible. So are we still first century Jews in the 21st century? No. I hope not. Are we first century Christians? No. Well, there wasn't too convincing of answer to that one. No, seriously, does that mean that we're held bound to what somebody did in the first century? Come on, UCC people, you all got this, remember? That's why we don't have creeds in our church. Because we respect them, we honor them, we reverence them, we think they're great that somebody in the 4th century decided that's what their faith should be. But we're not held bound to the articulation of that faith in the 21st century. So therefore, we should read the Bible in a similar way. Anyway, I want you to look at this handout before, because she's going to start waving at me over there. So, what does the Jewish story of Abraham suggest? And in this, as Christians, and I was thinking of this earlier, Christianity is the largest religion in the world. Now, if you break Christianity down, of course, it covers all kinds of different denominations and different groupings and so forth. Islam is the second largest religion in the world. Christianity is about 1.5 billion people, adherents in the world. Islam is about now 1.2 billion and gaining fast on Christianity. Hinduism is the third largest religion with about 1 billion people. Buddhism, at least in organized religions, Buddhism is the next largest. Judaism actually is one of the smallest, only because of just the number of Jews after the Holocaust that are in the world, that there aren't that many Jews in the world. So you go from 1.5 billion, 1.2 billion Islam, down to, I don't know what the figure is, but it's probably not more than 30 million Jews in the entire world, maybe even smaller than that. But chronologically, Judaism is the first historically, with Christianity following and then Islam following. So you see, by the time we're going to look at, and I've got some Quranic text about Abraham, you'll see that by the time we come to the 7th century story of Abraham, as far as Islam tells it, that it's going to look very different from the story of Abraham, even if that story of Abraham is written in the 10th century BC, around 900 BC, and it tells us about Abraham, who lived about 1850 BC. So that's kind of the relationship. So this actually comes from a commentary by Walter Brueggemann on the book of Genesis. And I just want to point out, as an interpretive, so if I'm going to read those stories of Abraham, what can I see in these stories, or what can I begin to find, I don't want to say what's the meaning of the story, Because even when I say that, what's the meaning of the story, it's to suggest that if I tell you what the meaning of the story is, then that must be what it is in an absolute way, which cuts all of you off from finding meaning of your own in the story, which is really not the way I want to do it. But I'm making a suggestion in terms of the meaning. I said in the history that Abraham lives in Haran, or Abram and Sarai live in Haran. The book of Genesis tells us that we don't know when, we don't know what circumstances, we don't know why, a voice comes to Abram and says, go from this place to a place I will show you. And there I will make you a rich heritage. You will have descendants far too numerous to number. And all the peoples of the earth, and that's an important phrase, all the peoples of the earth will find blessing in and through you. And I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And that is the opening scene in the story of Abram. So if you look at the handout, the biblical story of Abram begins with a promise. Well, first of all, it begins with a command. Go from this place to that place. That's the first thing. But the command is hinged upon a promise that God seems to make to Abram, that if you do this, I promise to you that I will make you a rich heritage. So that Abram, in going, goes with the idea that at some point God is going to keep that promise. And seemingly Abram trusts that God will keep the promise. But what it requires is a couple of things. It requires, first of all, that Abram divest himself of everything that has identified his life. And what could you imagine if he's in Haran? What identifies his life at this point? What are some of the identity markers that Abram has there in Haran?
His land.
His land. His flocks. What else?
His wife.
His wife. What else? What comes along with the wife? Children. And what else comes along with the wife?
Money.
Money could come along with it. Absolutely, money is a part of it. What else comes along with the wife?
In-laws.
In-laws. So it comes up with the in-laws. So you not only have to deal with the wife, you have to deal with the mother-in-law and the father-in-law. And when you deal with the father-in-law and the mother-in-law, you're dealing with all the other sons and daughters in the family and all their families. So you see that when Abram is asked to go, he doesn't just go with Sarah. He goes with all the baggage that Sarah brings along with her besides his own baggage, right? And literally and figuratively. So he takes with him the flocks. Now think, some of those flocks have to be for their own livelihood, right? And how else do you get all of your other stuff? You have to have enough flocks that you can sell in the marketplace and the wool in the marketplace to get all the other things that you need. This is a huge endeavor. All right? It's not a simple move that Abram makes. And I want you to get a sense that when he's asked to do this, and I hinted at it, all of those things that you described are identity markers for who Abraham understands himself to be. I know who I am by virtue of what I own, what I'm associated with, who I'm associated with, where I live. Well, I mean, we still do this, right? You all know, many of you have lived in Phoenix long enough to know that anybody north of Thomas Road must be kind of suspect because, right? No? Well, let's see. So what's north of Thomas Road? Camelback. Well, let's face it, right? Well into the 70s, that some of the neighborhood contracts said that if you're not white, you can't live in this neighborhood. So that's within some of our memory, right? So that, if East Lake Park was the black park and Westlake Park was the Hispanic park, and you just knew, right? Those were identity markers that indicated your social status, your economic status, might even talk about, religious status, where you were, all of that. So you see, when Abram is asked to go to where God's going to show him, and I often say to the only place in the Middle East where there was no oil, like how stupid was that? That it means having to let go of everything that has determined his life to that point, to go to a place that's going to be solely determined by God. Now that's a really important spiritual and theological insight to consider. It's terrifying. But you see, here's where the second point of the story is. Seemingly, Abram does it without even questioning. And here's where we come to the second important theological question, Abram's faith. The first theological question is the promise that is made. If you do this, I will make you a rich heritage. The faith that's required of making this move is based upon Abram and Sarah's ability to constantly trust that promise will eventually have fulfillment. So if you look at your handout there, promise is understood as God's power and will to create a future shaped sharply discontinuous with the past and the present. God's resolve to form a new community wrought only by miracle and reliant on God's faithfulness. Now these are kind of spiritual, theological questions and issues, all right? The faith question is the capacity to embrace that future with passion so that the present can be relinquished for the sake of the future. Now I think we may not exactly have time this morning, but I think in that larger question of the three great Abrahamic faiths, that one of the things that we might have to begin to consider for ourselves is that same movement of relinquishing a past. Now what I mean by relinquishing the past is that the past has been defined by constant warfare and conflict and fight over territory and fight over whatever, that we might have to relinquish that past in order to embrace a future that is going to be defined by God. And how the Muslims will talk about that in I think, an interesting way that might give the rest of us insight on what that's going to mean. Anyway, so the crisis facing Abram and Sarah is as it is with each of us. We either can decide to live for the promise and therefore act to disengage from the present barren way of things, or we can live against the promise, holding grimly to the present ordering of life. And by the way, I think all of our churches are in the same kind of thing. Right?
Most people don't want to change.
We don't. So what do we end up doing? Holding grimly to the present and the past and realizing we're going to die. I keep telling my folks down in Sun Lakes, I said, as the youngest member of the congregation at 60, with the average age of our congregation at probably 80, that doesn't give us much time to figure out what our future is going to be. Right? And sadly, I say, and it might sound offensive, I suppose, but I said, while I warmly welcome more 80-year-olds into our congregation, we're not going to live very long if all we get is 80-year-olds in our congregation. And I'm sure you're facing a similar kinds of question and issue. So, the relevancy of the story of Abraham is very relevant. We can either hold on to the past, and the promise is out there, but we don't want to embrace the promise because we know that we have to give up a lot in order to go where. And you see, that's the story, right? Our identity has always been this, Abram says, but to go where God is directing him means to take on a new identity for which he has no evidence for. Why would I do something for which I don't know what it's going to be? We all want evidence and proof. We're all from Missouri. Show me. I'm convinced most of the biblical people are all from Missouri somewhere along the way.
The past represents a known.
It's known. Exactly right.
The future is a risk.
We don't know what it is. We have no idea. That's the story of ancient Israel. And the patriarchal story, however you want to interpret that, continues to be this struggle between holding for the promise while knowing that we have to keep relinquishing the past and the present in order to get to the future. So, any questions about that? I won't do this other handout that I've got there. Any questions? Because what time do you actually? About 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Then we better get going here. All right.
10 or 15 is okay.
Mike, why don't you help pass? You pass out these on this side over here. All right. So that's the Jewish. That would be the Jewish story. The Christian story about Abraham is very interesting, and these are some text on where Abraham figures into the New Testament. The first place that we encounter Abraham in the New Testament is in the Gospel of Matthew, which is the first Gospel. And the Gospel of Matthew starts off with the genealogy of Jesus. So it says in the text, it tells us that Abram was the first one, and then it goes through, Abram was the father of Isaac, Isaac was the father of Jacob, Jacob was the father of so-and-so, and it goes all through the generations down to Joseph, who is said to be the father of Jesus. The intent of Matthew's gospel, I think, is that if Mark is the first gospel to be written, scholars tell us, 65, that Mark's gospel doesn't tell us much about Jesus' family of origin. And in the first century, that when you are struggling as a Christian, a growing new young baby Christianity against more established Judaism, that if your founder doesn't have any kind of family heritage, then it makes him less credible. And so, because Mark doesn't have a family heritage of Jesus, that Matthew in the next generation, about 75 AD, to a mostly Jewish community, that Matthew has to set in concrete for his community the heritage of Jesus. So Matthew tells us that Jesus stands, and we can look at it, right? I mean, if you take... And by the way, well, let me finish. That if you take this lineage, you can trace it all the way back to Abraham, who is the first in the line. So that Jesus could say, he is a descendant of Abraham. And that becomes a very important identity marker for who Jesus is, and becomes an important identity marker for who the Christians are going to be. All right? So that's the first one. If you notice on that handout, that most of the rest of the text there, and I've kind of excluded some of the other gospel text, is that most of the rest of the text there come from Paul's writings, from Romans. Now what Paul has to do is, and most of Paul's writings come between about 57 AD to about 63 AD, and just to many scholars say between 30 and 33 AD is Jesus' death and resurrection. Paul's writings come about 57 to about 63 AD. So maybe about 20 years after Jesus is when Paul's letters come into being, let's say. Well, 20 years after Jesus, the question that Christians are asking is not the question that would be related to Judaism. How do we relate to that promise that God has made, all right, through the lineage of Abraham? But the question for Christians shifts to what's the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection? And how do we share in whatever that meaning's going to be? And if the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection is setting us free from sin or saving us in some fashion, then what we have to do is not only find a reason for Jesus' death, but we have to find a reason for why we're going to believe in Jesus. And what Paul is struggling with is that the Christian community, as it's moving from Judaism to the Gentile world, is that within Judaism, an important identity marker for belonging to the heritage of Abraham is what? For men. Circumcision. That you knew you were a Jew or a descendant of Abraham, because as the story in Genesis tells us, that Abraham is instructed to circumcise all the males in the community, so that from that generation on, they would know you cut a covenant, and that, graphically as it might sound, which is true, you cut the covenant so that a marker is placed on the males in the community to always remember that they are defined by God and connected to God through that covenant. That the Abrahamic covenant is a covenant of circumcision.
So rejecting that was a real trauma.
Well, it's a real trauma, and this is what Paul has to do, is to figure out how the new Christians can still claim connection to Abraham, but realizing that the Gentiles are not going to be too happy about becoming circumcised in order to belong. He has to figure out how he can circumvent circumcision in order to still claim heritage that Jesus himself had to Abraham. And how he does it is in that second story that on your handout on the 4 stories of Abraham, that the second story is that the promise, Abraham and Sarah are becoming like dried up old prunes. Nothing seems to happen. They still don't have a child. The Hagar and Ishmael story has happened. That Abraham says, I'm going to take matters into my own control. Sarah, in some stories, offers Hagar, her maidservant, to Abram. Hagar gets pregnant. The child born is Ishmael. God says, excuse me, you keep trying to control your own destiny and your own future. That isn't the bargain. That isn't the promise I made. The promise is made upon me determining your future. You can't keep controlling your future. Abram says, oh, okay. God says, you're right. I'm always right. God says back to Abram. In fact, and the second story says, God takes Abram out and shows him the stars of the heaven. And at that point I go, and what's that got to do with anything? Because I still don't have a child, and I'm 98 years old. And just a few Sundays ago in Advent, I said, can you imagine, again, picture Sun Lakes, all right? I said, can you imagine getting pregnant at 99 years old? And there was a gasp, an audible gasp in the congregation. Oh my God! People fainted, and and sitting in the front row was one of our church members who is 99. And I said, so I looked right at her and I said, could you imagine that? And out loud she says, no way! It was great. It was really that was like the first Sunday of Advent or something. Anyway, so the story in Genesis says that as God takes Abram out, again it's about promise in the Jewish tradition. God says, look at the stars of the heaven. And then the text says, and Abram looked and put his faith in God, and it's given to him as the credit of righteousness. Whatever Genesis means by that, I should tell you that the characteristic of righteousness is a characteristic reserved only for God. God is the only one who's righteous. So to have it credited to a human that they are righteous means that that person has taken on a characteristic of God. All right? So what Paul does is he looks at these stories and he says, now this is how the Christians are going to understand Abram. Paul says, as I read the story, that declaration of righteousness based upon the faith of Abraham precedes the story of circumcision. So therefore, to remain children of Abraham, to claim heritage to Abraham as Jesus himself is a descendant of Abraham, how can we, Gentiles, be descendants of Abraham if we are not held to the act of circumcision? we can be descendants of Abraham because, in the same way that Abram put his faith in God and it was credited to him as an act of righteousness, so when we put our faith in God, it too becomes an act of righteousness that does not require of us to cut ourselves in circumcision. And so Christians honor Abraham as the father of faith, and that we share now the heritage of Abraham. And in a sense, Christians would say, and so look now at the Christian community. Is it not a fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham that he would be the ancestor of many? So in a sense, Christians say, it has not happened solely within Judaism. It now happens in Christianity. And so Abram is our ancestor in faith in that way. Last one, and these you're going to, some of these you're going to have to read on your own. These are the texts in the Quran that relate to Abraham. And I hinted at it already. The story in Genesis says that when Hagar becomes pregnant with Ishmael, that God is offended because Abram and Sarah have plotted to fulfill the promise in their own way. And so God, in a sense, instructs Abram that he must get rid of Hagar and this child. And probably in the ancient culture, to have a child by way of your maidservant doesn't sound as bad as what it sounds to us. It probably was a normal course of affairs, especially if one of the partners was sterile, couldn't have children, that in order to hand on your property and your identity, you needed to have children, all right? It could pass to your brother, the next brother in the line, but your own child would be the better inheritor of the property.
Did you get one?
No.
I'm sorry.
What give me, okay. That what Muslims say, and if you look at the text in Genesis, it tells us that when it was decided to drive Hagar out of the camp, that God doesn't reject Hagar or Ishmael, but rather goes out into the desert with Hagar and Ishmael and continues to provide nourishment and care for them, is what Genesis says. And then it says, an amazing thing, is that the descendants of Ishmael are, and it lists several groups of people who are the descendants of Ishmael. Among them are a group of people called Arabs. And the story goes on, because Ishmael's no longer the story of Genesis, Isaac is the story of Genesis, and seemingly Ishmael is no longer mentioned in the story, except when it comes to Romans. And Romans, Paul makes the contrast between Sarah, who is the mother of the inheritor of the promise, and Hagar, who's the exile, who's not the inheritor of promise. And he makes all the contrast between Jews and Christians is what he's making in that instance. The story says that, in fact, from the Muslim perspective, is that since Ishmael was the firstborn of Abraham, that it was actually Ishmael whom God asked to sacrifice on the mountain, not Isaac. And so that Ishmael, when God asked Ishmael to be sacrificed, Abram dutifully does it, and it's seemingly the same story as the Isaac story. And when God says, no, I don't want you to kill Ishmael, that in fact Abram goes with Hagar and Ishmael down to, quote, modern-day Arabia, and guess where they end up? Mecca. And Mecca, it was indeed the home of Muhammad, and Muhammad and the tribe that Muhammad is related to seemingly had an oral tradition of them being descendants of Ishmael. And so now, as the Quran is revealed to Muhammad, that the story of their origin, as much as the Abram story in Genesis is the story of the Israelite Jewish origin, that the story in the Quran of their origin takes the story of Abraham, as I suggested earlier, and interprets the story of Abraham as it might have come out of their oral tradition to make the story arrive at the time of Muhammad, so that now the followers of Muhammad, who will be called Muslim, or the followers of Muhammad, are asked to do what Abraham was asked to do. God takes Abraham out, shows him the stars of the heaven, and what did Abraham have to do at that point? Well, Genesis says, and Abram put his faith in God, and it's credited to him as an act of righteousness. The Muslim story says, God asked Abram, here's the word, to submit to God, Allah, and in that it's an act of righteousness. And guess what the word submit in Arabic is? Islam. So that as Abram submits himself to God, that act of submission to God becomes the key for every Muslim who must now also submit themselves to God in the way that Abram did, and so forth. So, and you can read down through, so what I've done is give you, you can read through the Old Testament, I've given you the New Testament, and I've given you the Quranic text. Let me just kind of conclude with a statement. If we consider that last point, that the Islamic story, the Muslim story, is the submission of Abram to God, I suspect that we as Christians, given what Paul says in Romans, we don't have to go too far distant from that, because the idea is that as Christians, how it's often said for us as Christians, accept Jesus as Lord and Savior, or be born again, that in a sense, what that action is a submission of myself, my will, my intent, to the purposes of God, so that from that point of accepting the faith, as Abraham's story suggests, I become defined by God. That's not that different from what Muslims talk about. Nor for Jews. While for Jews, it does include the cutting of the covenant in circumcision, it could be said the same way. That the struggle constantly through Israel and ancient Israel, and really in contemporary Jews, is, are they going to carry the identity of God in the world? Meaning, are they going to be defined by their willingness to submit themselves in covenant to God? So perhaps the common ground that all three religions could do is, as I suggested at the beginning, we have to, in order to embrace the promise of shalom, salam, or peace, that we all have to begin to submit our will and intent to God. Meaning that it is not identity that we think is defined by where we live, what kinds of things we have, how many flocks we've got, how many wives we have, whatever. That's not what defines us. But it's, and I'll give you the text because I said it to our men's group this morning. In Exodus 34, when Moses comes out of the desert because the Israelites are complaining, we should have stayed back there. You brought us out here in the desert to die. Edward G. Robinson is whining and croning, just going on and on and on and on. And Moses says, these people are ready to drive me crazy. I'm ready to kill myself over these. God, you got to do something. And God says, fine, come up here. And Moses says, I want to know who you are. I want to know more about you. And Moses goes up the mountain, and God says, the text says, and God passed by Moses saying, the Lord, and here's the phrase, The Lord, slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. That's the character of God. If that's the character of God, then you see both Jews, Christians, and Muslims in submitting to God, submit to God when we are slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. Every prayer that a Muslim says begins with the phrase, Allah, the compassionate and merciful one. Isn't that interesting? Compassion and mercy are part of the act of submission to the will of God. Now, if we just paid attention to that, huh? All right. Everybody's hungry.
Thank you.
Thank you.